The biggest challenge when it comes to reducing our usage of filler words like ahs and ums is that we might not even know how often or where exactly in our speeches do we tend to use filler words the most. And I used to struggle with this way too much. But there were a few processes that I could set in place that really helped me become aware of these filler words and how to go about reducing them, not only in speeches or presentations, but even in day-to-day conversations. And that's what we're going to talk about here. How to know and become aware of how often and where we're using these filler words and how to reduce their usage so that we can make our speeches flow a lot more smoothly. Hey, my name is Rudeep and I'm the founder of Frantically Speaking, and I love learning about effective communications and sharing those learnings with you so that you can level up your communications game as well. So we're going to break this down into 3 parts. First is how do we write our speech in a way that helps us reduce our usage of filler words. Second is how do we practice in a way that makes us aware of how often we're using these words. And lastly, what can we do on an everyday basis that will help us become aware as well as help us reduce the usage of these filler words. So starting with writing your speech. The very first thing I do that helps me make my speech flow a lot better is to simply structure it. It's only when we don't know where we're going or we tend to forget our next few lines that we tend to fill in those gaps by using filler words. But having a good structure and outline prepared of your speech and having that internalized will really help you chunk down all the information so that you know exactly where you're heading after you finish, let's say, your introduction, your story, and your conclusion, as opposed to just scrambling about without knowing what you're going to be speaking about next. When it comes to structuring a speech, it's not about maintaining just a checklist of things that we need to do. It's simply about keeping the information blocked up. So if you're starting with the introduction, what are the top 3 things we're going to say in that introduction? And if we're moving on to the first story, what are the top 3 points that we're going to say in that first story? And this will simply help us know where we're going after each section of our speech and will help us reduce our filler word usage. The next thing to keep in mind when we're writing our speech is to use speech transitions within these structures. If you're moving from one story to another, if you're moving from one point to another, it's important to know what speech transitions to use at these junctures. For example, if you're talking about 3 different points, to use simple words like firstly, move on to the first point, secondly, move on to the second point, and lastly, move on to the third point. Or if you're talking about contradictory points, to use words or phrases like conversely, on the other hand, or contrast that with, will really help our speech flow a lot better and help us avoid using filler words by using these speech transition words or phrases instead. We have a whole list of speech transitions and those situations where you might need to use them linked down in the description below. And lastly, when it comes to writing your speech, make sure you're using short sentences. It's only when we tend to have long, drawn-out sentences that we tend to get lost with filler words. But if our sentences are short, punchy, to the point, the chances of us using those filler words drops down dramatically. Another simple thing to keep in mind is to use more personal stories within your speech so that you don't have to rely too much on memorization. Very often when I try to memorize my speech and I can't remember the next few words, I tend to fumble and automatically filler words tend to come out. But when I rely my content more on personal experiences, the need to memorize reduces, so the chances of using filler words also tends to reduce. The next section is how to practice in a way that helps us know and reduce our usage of filler words. When it comes to practicing, one of the best and most simplest ways is to simply record yourself practicing. Now that's a very common thing to do, but when I was specifically focusing on reducing my filler words usage, I did not video record myself. I only audio recorded myself. The thing is, when I do a video recording, I'm so much more focused on how I look, on my body language, my hand gestures, and all those other things that I tend to forget about the audio. So I used to do 3 audio recordings. The first one where I used to actually read my speech while recording it. This would give me the perfect picture of what the speech should look like with absolutely no usage of filler words because I'm actually reading my speech. The second time, I would just have notes prepared and just refer to those notes at important junctures when I might be forgetting my lines or not knowing what to say next. This second audio recording really helps me understand where I'm using filler words very often, where I need to use things like speech transitions to reduce the usage of these filler words, and parts where I just simply need more practice on because I'm finding myself getting lost over there. And the third recording is simply without any notes whatsoever, once I've reached a point where I know my speech well enough that I can say it without the usage of any notes. I found this one method to be so powerful that frankly, if we just follow this, it will dramatically reduce not just our usage of filler words, but even help us with our voice modulation, our tonality, and just help with the overall impact of our speech. Besides filler words, there are three things that we really should pay attention to when we are audio recording or practicing our speech. The first is whether we are speaking too fast or not. If you're a naturally fast speaker like me, the best way to really make us reduce our pace is to simply do this audio recording practice method. It helps us understand whether we are speaking fast in the first place, and once we're conscious of that, we automatically tend to reduce our pace, at least in our practice sessions, which will eventually reflect when we actually give our speeches. One handy tip to keep in mind is that if you're speaking too fast and when you practice speaking slowly, speak one notch slower than you think you should be speaking. And when you're practicing this, it might come across as though you're speaking way too slowly. But if you're a naturally fast speaker, we need that exaggerated practice so that it will reflect on stage when we actually go up and present. And the other two things to look out for when you're practicing is to know whether we are pausing enough and whether we have enough silences in our speech. Pausing and being comfortable with silences on stage is the best way to reduce filler words. And of course, it's very simple to say that you should pause more often if you want to make more of an impact with your speech. But the question is, where should you really be pausing? There are two very simple things that I keep in my mind that help me pause more often within my speech. One is when we are talking about our next big idea. So any point that we want to emphasize on, or any word or power phrase that we might be including, to pause for a second right before saying that word is a really great place to keep a pause within your speech. So even when you're structuring your speech, try to identify those places which you need to lay emphasis on, and make sure that when you audio record yourself practicing these speeches, you're actually pausing right before the emphasis point. And the second thing to keep in mind is to punctuate properly. When you're writing down your speech, don't just write like the way you're going to speak, write the way you would actually write. This simply means that when you're writing down your speech, if you have commas, full stops, and paragraph changes, actually make sure you pause when you're even speaking and practicing your speech when these punctuations show up. And this is exactly why structuring your speech is so important in the first place, because they really help us understand where we need to pause so that we can reduce our usage of filler words and make our speech flow a lot more smoothly. And the last section is every day. What can we do every day that will help us reduce our filler words, not just in speeches or presentations, but even in daily conversation? The first and very basic thing is that if you have people who you're close and comfortable with, like your spouse, your siblings, or parents, or friends, if you use filler words way too often, tell them what filler words you're using and tell them that every time I use those filler words, point it out to me. For example, I tended to use the filler word and stuff like that way too often. So I told my three best friends who I spend most of my time with that every time I use this filler word, please let me know about it. And that just helped me get a lot more aware of when I was using this word and helped me eventually reduce its usage. And the last thing that I want to leave you with is this lovely quote from Tony Robbins. I'm paraphrasing it a little bit, but essentially someone had asked him, "Where did you learn to speak so well in front of crowds?" And he simply said that he treated every conversation like it was a speech. And that's exactly what we should strive to do as well. No matter who we're speaking to, if we try and make those conversations like speeches, we'll automatically improve our delivery, not just in our day-to-day conversation, but in every area of communication. Next time you're speaking to someone, try to make sure you're using more emphasis, more pauses, you're aware of the filler words you're using, you're trying to modulate your voice, you're using more hand gestures than possible. This might seem a little animated in the start, but slowly you'll start finding your style, which will eventually translate onto the stage. And that's essentially it. How do we get more aware of our usage of filler words, and how do we work towards reducing them? If you have any more questions when it comes to things like public speaking, communications, or anything around that space, we have a bunch of in-depth articles and resources dedicated just for that. So go check out franticallyspeaking.com.